Today, we're going to break down a really serious and complex topic: Arizona's specific law on sexual assault, also known as ARS 13-1406. We're going to get into what it actually means, how it's used in court, and the pretty severe consequences that come with a conviction. So, let's dive in. But first, before we go any further, we have to get this out of the way. This is a crucial disclaimer. What we're talking about today is purely for educational purposes. It is absolutely not a substitute for real legal advice. If you are facing charges under this law, you need to speak with an experienced criminal defense lawyer in Arizona immediately. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll define what sexual assault actually is under Arizona law. Then, we'll look at the 3 things a prosecutor must prove to get a conviction. After that, we'll take a deep dive into the most critical part, legal consent. Then we'll cover the penalties, and we'll wrap up with a couple of key facts about this law that, honestly, might surprise you. So, let's start at square one. What exactly is the state of Arizona defining as sexual assault? The legal definition itself is very direct. It really boils down to 3 parts: the mindset, which is intentionally or knowingly; the specific act itself, sexual intercourse or oral sexual contact; and then the absolute core of the whole thing, without that person's consent. Honestly, that last part is what the entire case usually hinges on. And you have to understand, this law's reach is really broad. It's not just about violent attacks that might come to mind first. It's written to cover non-violent situations too, like what's often called date rape, where someone's ability to say no has been compromised by drugs or alcohol. You see, in the eyes of the law, it's the absence of consent that defines the crime, not necessarily the presence of a violent struggle. Okay, so how does that definition actually work in a courtroom? Well, for someone to be convicted, the prosecution has the entire burden of proof. They have to prove 3 specific things, and they have to prove every single one of them beyond a reasonable doubt. Think of it like a 3-legged stool. The prosecution has to build all 3 legs for the case to stand. First, the defendant's state of mind. Was the act intentional? Second, did the physical act actually happen? And third, the big one, was there a lack of consent? If they fail to prove even one of these, the whole case falls apart. So what does intentional or knowing really mean? Well, intentional is pretty much what it sounds like. You meant to do it, it was your goal. Knowing is a little different. It just means you were aware of what you were doing. You don't have to know it was illegal, just that you knew you were engaging in that specific act. The second element is all about the physical act itself. And let me tell you, the law gets incredibly specific here, leaving basically no room for argument. It defines sexual intercourse as any penetration, even the slightest, with a body part or an object. That level of detail is there for a reason. It takes the debate away from the physical what happened and focuses the case on the other elements, especially consent. And that brings us to the most complex, and often the most fought over, part of the entire law: legal consent. This is about so much more than just a simple yes or no. This really gets to the core of it. What a person thought or believed about consent doesn't matter if it doesn't meet the strict legal standard. In court, it's not about a simple yes or no. The law forces them to look at the totality of the circumstances to decide if consent was even legally possible in that situation. So this leads to the most important question of all, right? What are the specific situations where Arizona law just flat out says a person cannot legally give consent? The law is crystal clear on this. It lists out these scenarios where consent is legally impossible. You got the obvious ones, like using physical force. But it also includes coercion, using threats or intense pressure. And crucially, a person can't consent if they're physically incapacitated, like being asleep or unconscious, or if they're mentally incapacitated, whether that's from being severely intoxicated, on drugs, or due to a disability. The common thread in all of this is that the person couldn't make a free and informed choice. So knowing the definition is one thing, but what actually happens if someone is convicted? Let's shift gears and talk about the sentencing and the lifelong consequences that come with it. So what are we talking about here? It all starts with this number, 2. Under this law, sexual assault is always a Class 2 felony. And to give you some perspective, that's one of the most serious crime classifications Arizona has, right below first-degree murder. There's no lesser version. And from there, the penalties can get much, much worse. The law identifies what it calls aggravating factors that can make the sentences just skyrocket. We're talking about things like using date rape drugs, causing a serious physical injury, or if the victim is under 15. That last one triggers a whole special category called a dangerous crime against children, or DCAC. This chart really lays out how drastic those increases are. For a victim who's 15 or older, the prison term is between about 5 and 14 years. But look at that jump when the victim is 13 or 14. The minimum is 13 years. If the victim is 12 or younger, it becomes a life sentence, with a mandatory minimum of 35 years behind bars. And if serious physical injury is involved, that's also a life sentence. And on top of all that prison time, there's a mandatory, non-negotiable consequence: lifetime registration as a sex offender. This isn't something that can be bargained away, it's forever. And it comes with strict, ongoing requirements that change every aspect of a person's life. Okay, as we start to wrap this up, let's hit on two final crucial details about this law. And these are things a lot of people don't realize. First up is just a matter of wording. You may have noticed we haven't really used the word rape. That's on purpose. In Arizona's legal code, there's no crime literally called rape. What most people think of as rape is prosecuted under this exact law as sexual assault. Legally speaking, in Arizona, they're the same thing. And for our final key fact, a massive question: how long does the state have to actually file charges after something allegedly happened? The statute of limitations? The answer is as simple as it is stunning. There is no time limit. In Arizona, there is no statute of limitations for sexual assault. That means charges can be brought forward at any point, no matter how many years or even decades have gone by. And that kind of leaves us with one last, bigger question to think about. We've seen just how specific this law gets, especially around this idea of consent, defining capacity, coercion, awareness. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How does a legal definition like this act as a sort of mirror, reflecting what a society really values when it comes to personal autonomy and justice? It's definitely something to chew on.